Chapter 13. The Scottish mist settled over Ear House, thick and grey, swallowing the drilling sounds of the men outside. Inside the study, Paddy Mayne stood by the window, his silhouette bold against the light. He wasn't thinking about Monty or the red berets they'd been forced to wear in Termoli, the berets he'd refused to don until Monty himself gave him leave to keep his sand-coloured original. He wasn't thinking about the trains they'd blown in Italy or the look on Reg Seeking's face when he couldn't pull the trigger on those prisoners. He was thinking about blood. Joey, his sister, sitting in a cell in cold. It's because a French journalist with jasmine-scented skin decided to play God with their lives. She's out of the picture. Bill, Paddy said, his voice low. Dangerous. Eve, did you hear what I said, Mayne? Bill Sterling didn't look up from the desk. He looked broken, a man who had traded his career to buy the SAS a chance at survival. I heard you, Paddy. Don't you know David's been sent back? Paddy stepped into the light, his eyes burning. He was to go to STHQ, but they've diverted him. He's in that rock with Joey. And you're sitting here talking about Pathfinders and Normandy. I have to talk about Normandy, Bill said quietly. If we don't win the landing, there is no Germany to march into. There is no rescue. Paddy's internal monologue was a chaotic roar, a broken bar. I keep waking up and finding myself alive, no matter how hard I try. Owen is dead, my men are executed under Hitler's orders, and now Joey is bait. He'd spent his life railing against the Sterlings and the Daltons and the Clarks of the world, thinking they were the enemy. He hadn't realized that while he was blowing up planes, Bill was fighting a war of paper and shadows to keep the unit from being erased. But the cost. The cost was Joey, a broken bar. When I get to Germany, Paddy growled, I'm going there. I'm going to Colditz. As am I. A voice came from the doorway. It was Henry Druce. He stood there with a strange, quiet intensity. Druce was a rarity of the upper classes. He had the reckless, cavalier daring of David Sterling, the kind of man who would jump into a hail of bullets just for the hell of it, but he possessed a kindness of heart, a generosity he'd inherited from working under Bill. He had been there in France. He had seen the betrayal. He had been the one to escape and bring the truth back to SAS, when the two battalions had met in Italy. I'm coming with you, Paddy, Druce said, his voice steady. I've sworn it. Josephine is your sister, but she's my compatriot. We were in the muck together. If you won't take me, I'll find my own way. I won't leave her there. Paddy looked at Henry Druce, recognizing the same dark hunger for justice. Spoken like a true SAS man. Druce tells me it was hideous, Bill. What happened to the networks after Eve spoke? All this to keep Mansour alive and unsuspected? We had to, Bill said, his face a mask of agony. We needed her to move the deception along. If she was caught too early, the Germans would have smelled the trap at Normandy. With Joey as bait, Paddy spat. She was here, Bill, at Kiev, learning so games under your nose. And now she's Horhor's sister to the Germans and a dilemma to you. Paddy turned back to the window. He thought of his mother, the message he'd left her saying he wasn't fit for human company. He thought of the ghosts he went fishing with. He hoped to God that Eve Mansour would be found guilty as a traitor, that she'd feel the weight of rope for what she'd done. But mostly, he hoped Joey was alive. Bill and Dudley said she was, the intercepts proved it, but they were men of shadows. Blood was the only thing Paddy trusted. I'm going to Normandy, Paddy said, grabbing his sand-colored beret. I'll lay your path, Bill. I'll be the unstoppable force you want me to be. But once the door to Europe is open, I'm coming for my sister. And God help anyone, British or German, who stands in the way of a Mayne and a Sterling going home. 888,888,888. The air between Josephine and David was a volatile mix of gunpowder and high-proof defiance. Josephine set the brandy between the two of them, and sat with the coarse, woolen blanket around her shoulders. Vindicated. He had heard it with his own ears. Unless he was going to deny it to himself again, in which case, there was no hope for reason. The distant church bell from the town chimed 12 and, over the courtyard, blustery wind of a storm accompanying the ever-searching spotlights. David slipped onto the camp bed next to her, his hand throbbing from the paperweight blow Josephine had dealt him earlier. It had to be the look of the thing. That was what the truce had implied. Knowing what he knew now, Sterling wished now that he hadn't hit her face quite so hard. But glad that he had done, though, for she may well have been telling the truth. But Josephine O'Neill was thoroughly infuriating. 88,888,888. While David and Josephine played their reckless game of one-upmanship, Paddy Mayne was orchestrating a symphony of violence. He wasn't waiting for London's permission. He wasn't waiting for the war to end. "I need 4 men," Paddy growled, slamming a map of Saxony onto a wooden crate. 4 men who don't mind dying in a castle and a pilot who's lost his sense of self-preservation. "You're going to jump into the heart of the Reich for a man who's already a prisoner?" Jim asked, his voice skeptical. "I'm going for the man," Paddy said, his voice dropping into that terrifying, quiet register. He pulled the intercept from his pocket, the one mentioning Josephine O'Neill. "And I'm going for the sister they stole from me." They think they can use a Mayne as a tool for their propaganda. They're about to find out what happens when you poke the bear. Paddy looked at the map, his thumb tracing the jagged terrain around Colditz. "We fly in, we drop low, we burn the gates, and we take them back." David Sterling and Josephine O'Neill. "And God help anyone who tries to stop me from bringing my sister home." "I'm with you too," Henry Druce told him. "Without her, I would be dead." "So would we all, Henry lad," Paddy told him. He rolled up the map then got to his feet. They may be in Europe, but it was 500 miles to Leipzig. He'd let no bastard French fill up their jeeps that night. 888,888,888. And in Lipsk, a shadowy figure linked to the German atomic weapons program which they were ensuring failed, linked to allied contacts through spurious and outrageous conveyances, alerted the German resistance in the Saxony region. They did not come with bombs and bullets, but defiance and inconveniencing and shielding of runaways from the castle. They had lost husbands, fathers, brothers, and sisters and wives and mothers too, all for the German ideal, all for an ideology many could never fulfill. 3 individuals awoke to action, all aware that there was to be a big escape in the early hours. They were ready. In the labyrinthine passageways and tunnels they had replicated, mirroring those made by the officers escaping. Milo had been in contact. They would be ready. 888,888,888. "We did it," Josephine told him, quietly as she stood, back pressed against the door of the solitary cell. It was as cold as tomb. Yet there was an electric buzz of the static of their mutual hatred. Hearts hammering from the adrenaline of the illicit transmission, and the sudden drop into the silence of the cell. Both caught their breath. Sterling looked up to her, and watched her pace, not least to imbibe a modicum of warmth in her frame. "Only just." "Your reliability, Josephine," Sterling's voice grated, cutting through the dark. He sat on the floor, legs sprawled, watching her with a challenging gaze. "You fumbled the frequency. It's almost as if you wanted to be caught." "Perhaps that was the idea." "I saved your life, you arrogant, privileged shit," she snapped, sitting on the edge of the bed, the blanket falling from her shoulders. Josephine took the lid off the bottle of spirit and put it to her lips. "And you know it. By 4, we will be out of here, the unbreachable castle." After a big gulp, she looked across to him. "Cognac, Egger's best." He stared at her too, then took the bottle. The spirit was chilled, but warmed when he gulped it down. What a waste of good brandy. It should be served in a wide bowled glass and savoured. He gulped some more. "Now what?" Josephine sat back on the camp bed. "I've locked the door," Sterling told her. "If anyone comes, then you can pretend you were interrogating me." When she didn't move, he reached towards her jacket to check the key was there. Josephine scowled, struck his hand away then pulled the key out. Then, she replaced it. "Now what?" "We don't sleep." From his jacket, Sterling flicked out a deck of cards. "What? Racing demon?" she scoffed. "Snap, poker." Sterling raised an eyebrow, searching for her surprise. "With what?" "I have no Reichmarks. Do you?" Sterling looked over her figure. "There's something you have which could easily be lost, or won. she told him. It's bloody freezing in here. She took up the cognac bottle again, drinking it deeply without looking away from Sterling. Deal. David lost the first hand. A clumsy, alcohol-heavy misplay. He didn't look at the cards. He looked at the bruise on Josephine's neck, the one he'd given her when he'd pinned her against the chapel's loft wall to keep her silent while a patrol passed. He looked surprised and disappointed. "Jacket," she commanded, her blue-green eyes glinting with a cold, vengeful triumph. "Unless the Phantom Major is suddenly shy." David stood, his tall frame looming over her. He undid the buttons carefully, and threw it at Josephine, the coarse fabric hitting her face. She pushed it onto the solitary cell's camp bed, noting his thin, regimental issue, damp with the sweat of their frantic crawl through the castle's passageway. He pointed to a puckered, angry scar on his ribs. "That was from the ambush in Benghazi. The one your friends in Berlin knew was coming. You owe me more than a shirt for that, Ethan." "Not my friends," she told him, as her senses enjoyed his muscular body, and fought the urge to put her hand to his chest. He raised an eyebrow. Sterling knew she was probably telling the truth about everything, and that was what was irritating him. Josephine's hands shook as she dealt the next hand. She lost on a pair of tens against David's kings. She didn't wait for him to speak. She stood up, her diminutive frame shaking because of the inevitable. She tore at the silver buttons of her grey rye jacket, showing her blouse. Sterling looked over her torso, and reached for her arm. "A big loss. You forfeit this too," he told her, putting his hand on the silk. Josephine pushed it away, crossly. "That's not the rules." "When did we discuss rules?" He made to touch her again, and Josephine pushed his hand away a second time, taking up the cards herself, then swearing when she lost that hand too. "I can help," Sterling smirked, as she tried to undo the pearl buttons, the alcohol impeding her accuracy. Josephine backed away and concentrated, then, when she had managed, slipped the blouse over her shoulders. She draped it carefully over one of the chairs, it had been expensive, and then turned back to Sterling, hands on her hips. Sterling breathed at her form. Beneath the blouse was a thin, silk camisole that looked absurdly delicate against the grime of the cell. Josephine stepped into his space, to hand him the cards, forcing Sterling to see the silver burnt scars on her shoulder, the mark of the train bomb that had turned her husband to ash, her badly mended collarbone from her plunge to the cobbles. "You think you know pain because you've got a few holes in you?" she whispered, her face inches from his. "I watched the only man I ever loved become part of the wreckage on a train line to Galway. There were scores of British soldiers on that train," he shot back, remembering the incident, which had been widely reported. Josephine scowled, yet she did feel regret for her hand in that bombing, which had been entirely absent in her psyche at the time. For a long time. "That was the point," Josephine returned, hotly. "You're just a bored boy playing with a regiment of wooden soldiers." David's hand shot out, his fingers digging into the muscle of her arm, a bruising grip of rage and revenge. "And you're a banshee who's forgotten how to feel anything but spite." Josephine struggled her arm away, nursing it with her other hand. "The thing about Banshee is they scream about impending death." She narrowed her eyes. "I wonder whose, in this case?" Sterling didn't answer. He simply snatched the bottle of cognac from the floor, the glass clinking against his teeth as he took a swallow that would have felled a lesser man. The alcohol was a searing line of fire down his throat, momentarily dulling the phantom ache in his ribs, but sharpening the edge of his temper. He much preferred whiskey, he considered, appraising the spirit, but this would have to do. "Deal," he barked, the word a sharp command. The cards felt like sandpaper in Josephine's trembling hands. The small cell was thick with the smell of spilled brandy and their mutual resentment. She dealt frantically, her arm shaking because of the cold. David didn't even look at his hand until the last card hit the damp stone. He flipped them over one by one. A flush. Clubs. Josephine stared at her own hand. A broken straight. Useless. She felt the chill of the room finally bite into the skin of her shoulders, her camisole offering no protection against the draft or the weight of Sterling's gaze. She felt her nipples harden, and saw him notice. The skirt, Sterling said. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. He wasn't looking at her legs, he was looking at her eyes, searching for the moment she would break. Unless you'd rather trade for information, tell me who gave the order for the Galway line. He reached to her waist, and she slapped his hand away. Go to hell, she spat. She stood up, her movements unsteady. I'm already there, he shot back, undisguised loathing in his voice. The brandy was singing in her ears now, a high, mocking whistle. She unbuckled the heavy wool skirt, letting it pool at her ankles in a heap of drab grey. She kicked it toward him, standing in her stockings and the silk camisole, looking like a ghost caught in a landslide. Your turn, Major, she hissed, swaying slightly. Or is the great SAS pioneer afraid of a few goosebumps? Sterling's face remained a mask of aristocratic boredom, though the vein in his temple was throbbing. He took the cards. He dealt. He lost. It was almost as if the universe was mocking them both, prolonging the agony of their proximity. He didn't hesitate. He pulled the thin, sweat-stained shirt over his head, bearing a chest that was a map of the Empire's failures. Jagged shrapnel scars, the puckered entry point of a Morse round, and the raw, red welts from his most recent interrogation by the guards. They sat now in their undergarments, two ruined instruments of war stripped of their uniforms, their ranks, and their pretenses. You're shaking, David noted, his voice softer now, but no less cruel. It's the cold, she lied, reaching for the brandy. It's the guilt, he rebuffed, grabbing her wrist before she could reach the bottle. He pulled her forward until there was no air between them and Josephine could feel the heat radiating from his skin. Josephine leaned in, her breath smelling of grapes and outrage. While my actions have been for the good of my country, yours have caused damnation to yours. Josephine stepped back, stumbling on her skirt, and he watched her with undisguised amusement. She scowled at him. We are both monsters, Sterling. The only difference is that you were born with a silver spoon to feed yours, and I had to grow teeth to survive mine. She snatched the cards back, the deck spraying across the floor in her haste. Again, everything. One hand. If I win, you tell me you believe all I have told you. If you win. She paused, her eyes darting to the locked door. If I win, Sterling whispered, his grip on her wrist tightening just enough to hurt. You stop being a martyr for 5 minutes and look at me without trying to kill me. The silence that followed was heavier than the stone walls surrounding them. The cards were a mess on the floor. Josephine gathered them with a fumbling, desperate intensity, her nails scraping the cold stone. She didn't bother with a fancy shuffle, she simply mashed the deck together and dealt 2 cards each, face down. She was drunk, and she wanted this to be over. 1 card, she muttered, the brandy making her tongue feel heavy. No draws. Pure blind luck, Sterling, or fate. Whatever you want to call the god that hates us both. David stared at the 2 small rectangles of cardboard. He didn't reach for them. Instead, he reached for the bottle, drained the last of the cognac, and set it down with a hollow thud. The cell felt smaller, the air thick with the scent of ozone and unwashed skin. Go, he commanded. Josephine turned hers over. A jack of hearts and a 2 of spades. A mediocre hand, a whisper of a hope quickly silenced. She looked at David, her jaw set, waiting for the blow. David didn't move for a long beat. Then, he flicked his cards over with a callous snap of his wrist. An ace of diamonds. A king of spades. The silence that followed was absolute. Josephine felt the loss like a physical weight, a cold tide rising in her chest at the thought of the inevitable. Whether she wanted to stand naked before a man she despised or not, alcohol and spite were driving her on. You lost, he said. His voice wasn't triumphant, it was weary, stained with the same motivation via the meaningless that drove her. I know, she whispered, her gaze dropping to the silver burn on her collarbone. So, do your worst, look at me, mock me, silence me. David moved then, not with the violence she expected, but with a predatory, agonizing slowness, standing right in front of Josephine, inches from her silk-clad frame. I didn't want to see you silenced, he managed, his hand coming up to her face. She slapped it away. Liar. He leaned in, the distance vanishing. The kiss wasn't a romantic gesture, it was a collision. It tasted of bitter brandy, stale tobacco, and a decade of suppressed rage. It was a desperate attempt to feel something other than the encroaching shadow of death. Josephine's hands flew to his shoulders, her fingers digging into the muscle and the scar tissue of his ribs. She didn't know if she wanted to pull him closer or tear him apart. She bit his lip, drawing a metallic hint of blood, and he groaned into her mouth, a sound of pure, unadulterated frustration. They collapsed back against the camp bed, the frame creaking under their combined weight. The rules of their war, their countries, and their mutual hatred were burning away in the alcohol-fueled heat. In the dark of the solitary cell, there were no agents and no officers, just two broken people trying to fuse themselves back together before the 4 a.m. guard change and to make their way out. "You won," Josephine reminded him. He eyed her camisole. If it hid what he suspected, large and pert breasts, hardened nipples, a broken bar. A broken bar. It was the cold in that cell, a broken bar. But his silent words had no effect on his desire for her at that moment. "Call me by my name," Sterling demanded, as he handled her tits, prying at Josephine's pert nipples through the silk. "Sterling," she replied. "No," he demanded, between hasty, forceful mouthings of them, wetting the silk as he fought to dominate her delicate breasts. "My first name." "You never call me by my first name." In the break-in warfare, Josephine thrust her hand down his trousers. He was hard, and from her vague memory of recent moments, he had been so for some time. The bed frame shrieked, a piercing metal-on-stone wail as Sterling slammed her back. The brandy had stripped away the last of their inhibitions, leaving only a crude hunger that tasted of iron and wood smoke. He didn't lay her down, he conquered the space she occupied. Sterling's hands, calloused and massive, didn't offer a caress. He seized her wrists, pinning them above her head against the freezing stone wall, his fingers overlapping with a bruising, iron grip strength. He looked down at her with a predatory, hooded gaze, his chest heaving. With his free hand, he didn't unbutton the silk camisole. He hooked his fingers into the delicate neckline and dripped. The fabric hissed as it parted, exposing her breasts to the biting chill of the cell. My God, they were magnificent. His thumb found her nipple, already peaked from the cold and the adrenaline, and he rolled it between his fingers with a punishing, rhythmic pressure. Josephine let out an intake of breath that she had been holding, her back arching off the mattress. He leaned down, his mouth replacing his fingers, his teeth grazing the sensitive tip until she was twisting beneath him, her curses turning into frantic, rhythmic moans, while his other hand worked the other. "Still want to fight, Ethan?" He growled against her skin, his voice a vibration in her very marrow. She had no words, only her hips, rising to meet him. He shifted his weight, his hand sliding down the pale expanse of her stomach, disappearing beneath the lace of her knickers. He didn't wait. He drove two fingers inside her, finding her slick and scorching despite the cold. She was a furnace of resentment and desire. His thumb found the swollen knot of her clitoris, circling it with a relentless, expert friction that made her vision go white at the edges. She thrashed against his hold, her legs falling open in a desperate, involuntary invitation. The rules of their war were dead. David fumbled with his own trousers, his movements frantic, until he was bare to her. He didn't seek a gentle entry. He braced himself and drove into her with a singular, violent thrust. Her muscles caught his foreskin, making him gasp with unalloyed pleasure. Josephine's head collided with the stone wall with a dull thud as he collided with her. Sterling was massive and unyielding, filling her until she felt she might break. She locked her legs around his waist to make his penetration even deeper, digging her heels into his bottom, pulling him deeper, wanting to absorb the very rage that drove them both on. He began to move with a savage intensity, heavy and wet, that echoed in the silence of the solitary cell. Josephine's hands, finally freed from his grip, raked down his back, her nails carving red marks into his sweat-sheened skin. She found the scars on his ribs and squeezed, her teeth sinking into his shoulder to stifle the screams that were clawing up her throat. The friction was a wildfire. David's breath came in ragged, animalistic bursts as he buried himself in her again and again, his body a map of scars and tension. He watched her face change because of what he was doing to her, her pupils dilating in her blue-green eyes. "Say it," he hissed, his pace reaching a frantic, terminal velocity. "Say my name." "David," she sobbed, the word breaking as he pushed his hand between them, 2 fingers massaging her clitoris. She nearly came, but then he backed off. Josephine narrowed her eyes. The silence of the cell was replaced by the wet, rhythmic slap of skin and the ragged sound of their shared breath. As David leaned back for a second, his chest heaving, Josephine found one arm free from his bruising grip. She didn't use it to push him away. Instead, her hand slid down the sweat-slicked plane of his abdomen, her fingers curling around the base of him. He was thick, hot, and thrumming with a violent pulse. She squeezed, her palms slick with the brandy they'd spilled and the friction of their bodies. She felt the heavy weight of him, the sheer, arrogant power of the man translated into something primal and raw. Her thumb traced the velvet head, pulling his foreskin up and down, a bead of cum that smeared across her skin, before she began to masturbate him, with a frantic, desperate rhythm. Sterling's head snapped back, a low growl vibrating in his throat. "Josephine," he warned, his voice a jagged edge. "Shut up and take it," she hissed, her eyes locked on his, filled with a terrifying, nerve-tingling spite. She increased the pressure, her grip unyielding, forcing him to feel the exact moment his control began to splinter. She wanted to see the Phantom Major reduced to nothing but nerves and instinct. He didn't let her finish it with her hand. He seized her waist, his thumbs digging into her hip bones, and hauled her upward. He guided himself to her opening, the tip of his cock probing her slick, swollen heat before he drove home in one punishing thrust. Josephine's breath left her in a sharp, high-pitched sob. Her legs hooked around his waist, her ankles locking at the small of his back as she pulled him in deeper, her fingers raking through the hair at the nape of his neck. Every move was a battle. He set a brutal, driving pace, his weight crushing her into the thin mattress. Each time he withdrew, he went nearly all the way out, only to slam back in until their pelvic bones crashed together with a dull, sickening thud. Josephine met every lunge with a defiant upward thrust of her own, her internal muscles clenching around him in a rhythmic, desperate attempt to claim him, to break him, to own the very thing that was conquering her. The friction reached a fever pitch, a searing heat that made the freezing air of the cell irrelevant. David's movements became shorter, sharper, a frantic, terminal velocity. "Now," he choked out, his fingers bruising her thighs as he held her open for the final, violent surge. She felt him rupture inside her, a hot, pulsing flood that seemed to go on forever. The orgasm hit her like a physical blow, her internal muscles pulsing in a violent, rhythmic clenching around him. It triggered his own climax, a staggering, back-arching surge that left him trembling and hollowed out. He slumped over her, his forehead pressed into the crook of her neck, both of them heaving for air in the cooling dark. They lay there for some times, a tangle of scarred skin and cooling sweat, as the violent tremors finally subsided, leaving the cell in a ringing, heavy silence. The air was freezing, turning their mingled sweat into a cold sheen on their skin, yet the heat radiating between them was still stifling. David didn't pull away with his usual cold, military efficiency. Instead, he stayed heavy against her for a long moment, his forehead pressed into the hollow of her shoulder. His breathing, usually so disciplined, was a ragged wreck. Slowly, almost tentatively, he shifted his weight. He didn't stand up to reclaim his dignity. He slid onto his side, pulling the thin, rough woolen blanket over their cooling bodies. His hand, the same one that had pinned her wrists with bruising force minutes ago, moved with a jarring, alien softness. He reached up, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her lower lip, which was swollen and stained with a drop of blood where he'd bitten her. "Josephine," he murmured. The name didn't sound like a swear word to him anymore. She shivered, the adrenaline crash hitting her hard, and making her come again. She expected him to mock her, to re-establish the wall of high-profile officer arrogance. Instead, she felt his arm slide beneath her neck, drawing her head to his chest. Her ear pressed against the frantic, slowing drum of his heart. He tightened his grip, his fingers tangling in her hair, holding her with a desperate, quiet intensity. For a fleeting minute, the loathing was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching recognition. They were the only two people left in a burning world who knew exactly how much the other had lost. He kissed her forehead, a dry, lingering touch that felt more intimate than the frantic sex. His lips brushed her skin, and then he kissed her mouth. When she awoke, far later than the 4 in the morning pickup, Josephine stood, her legs momentarily betraying her with a faint tremor. She didn't look at his sleeping form as she gathered the ruins of her dignity. The silk camisole was a lost cause, a shredded rag of ivory lace, so she reached for her grey rye jacket, sliding her bare, bruised skin into the coarse, unforgiving wool. The contrast was a sharp reminder of the world outside this cell, the cold, the steel, and the lie. She walked to the door, her fingers finding the heavy iron key she turned earlier. Going so soon? Sterling's voice drifted up from the shadows of the floor. He hadn't moved. He lay back against the stone wall, his chest bare, looking like a fallen king in a tomb. He watched her with a lazy, devastating smirk that made the heat flare back up her neck. I had intended to ask for a review of the service, Josephine, but your mouth was a broken bar occupied at that moment. Josephine froze, her hand on the lock. She felt the flush, not the frantic heat of the brandy, but a deep, humiliating crimson, spread from her collarbone up to her cheeks. He watched her body. You're a pig, David, she snapped, though her voice lacked its usual icy precision.